it's just this weird merging of you have. So, for instance, one character's hand or arm rather gets
best part of the whole fucking movie. Love this. Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is episode number 13. I'm your host, Anita Sarkeesian, and I am joined by my trustworthy crew of hooligans, Ebony Astor.
Hey, monkeys.
And Carolyn Pettit.
Hey, y'all.
This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love, or alternatively, we're the feminist killjoys coming for your media, depending on your perspective. On today's show, we're going to check in with the latest pop culture news, dive into the Cloverfield Paradox, the latest film in the loosely connected Cloverfield science fiction franchise. Then we're going to talk about how Formula One racing has announced removing grid girls from their tournaments and some of the backlash to that. We'll finish the show by each sharing a little something in What's Your Freakout? And as always, exclusively for our fantastic drip backers, we'll be recording a bonus segment. This week, we're going to bring back a classic, Hate Mail Hootenanny. Everything Feminist Frequency produces, including this very podcast, is listener, reader, and fan supported. Thank you for helping us stay on the air and on the web. If you want access to special perks and exclusive backer rewards, join our podcast community at d.rip/femfreak. Now on with the show. Hey.
Hey, Anita.
Hey, how was your time here in San Francisco, Ebony?
It was fantastic.
The weather was so good.
It was so good. I will say that I was reminded, like every time I come to the Bay Area, I'm like, God, I wish I lived here. It's so wonderful.
We can trade.
I love Oak.
I don't want to live here anymore. I'll go to LA.
Yeah, except you know that I don't live in LA proper. I'm not going to tell you where I live because I know there's a bunch of freaking weirdos out there, but you don't want to live where I live, as wonderful as my suburban house is, whatevs. But no, I come to San Francisco, I love it, I have some good food, and then inevitably I wind up, on some random afternoon of walking up some like 40 grade hill in San Francisco, and I'm like, this is why everybody here is so skinny. This is not in my ministry. I can't do this. That town is laid out funky.
We got a lot of hills here, but it also means that we have beautiful summits, so you get to the top of the hill and it's like a breath.
I wouldn't know. My ass gave up. I was like, whatever's at the top, I don't need to see it.
All right, Carol, what is the entertainment news this week?
All right, well, first of all, big news is that Benioff and Weiss, the showrunners of Game of Thrones, it has been announced that they are going to be behind an upcoming series of Star Wars films.
All right.
So this is
sounds awful.
Yeah, I mean, so they released a joint statement saying, "We are honored by the opportunity, a little terrified by the responsibility, and so excited to get started as soon as the final season of Game of Thrones is complete." So real quick, this is interesting for a few reasons. One being that there was all this talk about the show Confederate, which they were supposed to be showrunners of, like this alternate universe America where slavery is still a thing, which sounded tremendously awful. Now there's no mention of that whatsoever. So the status of Confederate is kind of in question now because of this announcement. But also, more importantly to me is, these are two people who I am not at all interested in seeing what they would do with Star Wars. There's been a few tweets like, "Yay, maybe we'll finally get a mature R-rated Star Wars." And I'm like, that's not what we don't fucking need an R-rated Star Wars.
When Carolyn swears, she's
I'm
serious.
actually, So, we don't need a rapey or super violent Star Wars. That's just not what that franchise should be, in my opinion. So there's that.
Yep.
In other news, Jessica Jones is returning. And what I thought was really interesting, so I got an email from Netflix about the return of Jessica Jones, and the email actually touted, Jessica Jones returns on March 8th, International Women's Day. So they're actually tying the release in. And I'm come on. I'm looking forward to the series. I'm going to binge watch it. You better believe it, I am. But come on. And yes, representation matters. And all this, we're going to have tons of conversations about what this show means and everything. But I don't know. When you tie it in like that explicitly to International Women's Day, it just seems a little silly to me.
It's a little.
I like how you said that you got an email from Netflix, because at first I thought you meant like the leadership of like the VP of programming was like, "Hey, Caro, just wanted to make sure you saw this," which I know you have that kind of pull in this town, so that might have been what happened.
I got some connections.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to. Did you have another thing to add?
No. I'm done. I am swiped out. I have nothing more to say about any entertainment news.
Before we go then, if we still have time, I just want to say, because this drives me nuts, people stop putting together rapey fanfic about Kilgrave and Jessica Jones.
We will absolutely talk about Jessica Jones and all of that, because I'm with you on that. And I feel like we need a whole segment dedicated to that particular horrific.
I just wanted to drop that turd in the punch bowl.
Yep.
Okay, moving on.
Perfect. All right, moving on to the main segment.
Yeah.
The first topic we're going to talk about today is Cloverfield Paradox. This is the new science fiction show, or the new show in the sci-fi Cloverfield series.
The new film.
Franchise.
Yes.
Did I say show?
You said show.
I meant film.
Yeah.
It's cool.
It's
I know
all right.
things.
It's all right.
So Cloverfield came out in 2008, and then 10 Cloverfield Lane was in 2016. During the Super Bowl this year, there was the surprise announcement that Netflix was releasing the new show, Cloverfield Paradox.
The new film.
Yeah, whatever, man. That's exactly how I feel about it. This one is directed by Julius Onahan and produced by J.J. Abrams, and is about a crew stuck in space for years doing experiments to create alternative lasting energy. So we actually all watched this together in the office last week, which we have a strict rule of like not watching things together so that we stay fresh for the podcast.
Wait, we do?
Yeah. So we stay fresh
I didn't know
for the
we had that rule.
Well, it was more like we don't talk about it, but it was so hard not to talk about this throughout the whole viewing of the movie.
I thank God that y'all were there, because Anita, what couple of scenes just made me want to crawl out of my skin. And so if you and Carolyn had not been there, I straight up would have turned off the movie and closed my laptop and then just walked to Oklahoma. I would not have been able to finish it.
Let's throw up a spoiler alert so that we can talk about
Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. Jigsaw is the fake dead guy on the floor.
the worms.
Ebony's phobias. Oh God! Even though
we won't actually talk about it, but that really grossed out a lot of people.
So yeah, fast fact about Ebony. Why am I telling you this? I'm probably going to get a package full of worms in the mail.
I was actually like, we shouldn't say that.
Fear.
What if horrible people on the internet just start sending you images of worms? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, whatever. I asked for it. I hate worms. I don't care what they do for the planet. As far as I'm concerned, they're tools of the devil. And there was no need for them shits in Cloverfield Paradox. Like, they were, oh, man. Oh, God. Oh.
So, I guess to start off by trying to say something, I don't want to go so far as to say redeeming, but I do want to say, like, something positive about this film is that...
How do you know we don't have anything positive to say about the film?
Oh, I'm not.
Yeah.
Because she knows us.
I just
she knows us.
Because obviously, like, I totally think this is a stupendously bad movie. So I do...
Stupendously
bad. Stupendously bad. But... basically, like, I mean, it's an international space station, so it kind of has an ensemble cast, but really, if we're going to pick, like, a star, I think it would be Gugu Mbatha-Raw. And, I mean, she deserves better material than this, of course, and yet she's so good. Like, she just... in my opinion, she just is always so good in whatever she's in. And so, even in this kind of, like, schlocky material... I just loved her performance in this film. Like, there's a moment where she's communicating with her exposition boyfriend back on Earth, like the person whose role is just to, like, explain the whole scenario to the audience, and they share a kind of moment of pain and poignancy and connection around their children who have perished, and just this look that crosses her face. It's like filled with like genuine human pathos and emotion, even in this like utterly absurd movie. And so I was so moved, even in a movie like this. So I hope that she has a career full of like much better films than this because she is, I think, really exceptional. I just wanted to get that out of the way.
No, you're absolutely right. It's kind of a cliche to say, an actor elevates the material that they're in, but that's absolutely what she does in this piece. Coming from the position of being like a hardcore science fiction nerd, in which like any glimpse of like a brushed steel corridor or some slightly industrial space just scratches the itch I have for some generic version of the future. I enjoyed sitting through this movie with y'all, except for the worms part, which might as well have come straight from a horror film. It's standard by the numbers, cliche ridden generic science fiction that doesn't try to do anything interesting. Thank God, because clearly it's not smart enough to try anything interesting. And yet, nevertheless, there are occasional performances. So, Gugu's amazing, right? The actor, I think her name is Elizabeth Debnicki. I'm probably getting that wrong, but the woman who plays, the woman who merges with the ship.
Jensen.
A captivating figure to watch. She portrayed and inhabited that kind of alienation and just this vague sense that there's something unsettling going on incredibly well.
Yeah. I mean, I guess for me, when I think about this film, the question of whether it's a good or bad movie is sort of beside the point. The question is, because I feel like it's a movie that knows it's a bad movie and embraces that it's a bad movie. So then the question becomes, is it a good bad movie or is it a bad movie?
I don't know if it knows that it's bad.
I don't know. I mean, it's just...
I don't think the creators are like, we made a bad movie.
Well,
I think that they genuinely think they made a decent sci-fi film.
Okay. I mean, I don't... Yeah. Maybe... Sure.
I feel similarly to what Ebony said, where I'm just dying for some real sci-fi, and I realize that I've been. I'll talk about The Expanse on another episode, but I keep watching this stuff that I find disappointing or cliched or just not giving me very much, because at least it's scratching a little bit of the itch of wanting a really good sci-fi franchise or film to come out. And so my feelings about this were very much that it hit all the tropes. It was really predictable. I mean, we called most of the stuff that was going to come out. There was a lot of exposition. I don't think it's complete and utter trash, but I also don't think it was very good. Yeah,
I mean, I guess when I say that it's a bad movie that knows it's bad, I mean, yeah, maybe that's unfair, but still, when I think of, it's just this weird merging of, so for instance, one character's hand or arm rather gets
best part of the whole fucking movie.
So the character's arm gets eaten basically by the wall of the ship. And then later, some kind of Addams Family thing, the arm comes back and literally is wants to write a message to the
people. The movie is worth watching for that part alone.
And it's and there's never any explanation given for how this could be possible, even within the logic of
Do you remember the line that was the most amazing line in the whole movie? It was,
I don't.
What are you talking about, arm?
Oh. Arm. And said in Chris O'Dowd's wonderful Irish accent, right? Just, what you talking about, arm?
Yeah, that's right. It does. It sounds great. It sounds great.
It was seriously the arm thing was delightful. I did not see that coming.
Well, no, but I mean, how can you? I mean, it's just it's like they may as well have just rolled random plot device dice and just been like, oh, okay, well, it felt like, how in Cabin in the Woods, just so much crazy shit starts happening because it's literally like they have all these random generators for what kind of end of the world demons or whatever. It felt like something like that. Just close your eyes and point at a board, and whatever you land on, that's what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes no narrative sense either, because once it's used to kind of advance the plot a bit, it's completely left fallow, right? So, Mundy, the guy who loses his arm, apparently, after the first few people kind of, for lack of a better, phrase, get attacked by the ship, that stops happening. And I mean, after a ship eats a man's arm and then that arm reappears and, it's like, hand me a Sharpie. I got shit to tell you. Yeah. You expect that to happen more, right? Yeah. But then it stops happening. Like, was the ship like, okay, I've had enough, or the alternate dimension? There's no explanation or interesting non-explanation for why that doesn't happen. They even stop talking about it. Like, how could you not be jumping out of your skin at any moment after your colleague had his arm taken off? How would you, I'd be frozen in place thinking the ship was going to eat me.
Yeah, the psychological, there was no sense of psychological reality in terms of how the characters reacted to the situation they were in. But that's kind of out of necessity. Like, the plot has to keep moving forward. If they were all just completely catatonic with fear at the utter.
But I also feel like there was a moment where the captain who Commander Keel, I felt like there was a really nice scene where he is so horrified about what's going on. And it was at the beginning. Actually, it was when they realized that they were in a different. They didn't know what was going on, and Earth had disappeared. And he's in his room, and he's crying, and he's really upset, and he's just like. I thought that was actually really nice. Yeah. And then you see him walk into the next scene and be like, "Okay, I'm the commander. I have to take command." But he took that time to feel the horror and try to demonstrate that. The problem is that it was such a small. Tacked on bit of emotion that I think there was a lot of little tacked on bits of emotion that didn't create a whole in terms of what was actually happening here. Yeah. But in terms of representation, I wanted to talk about Tam.
Oh, right.
So Tam is she is the Asian representation on the crew that's trying to be, representative of different parts of the world, I guess.
There's the German guy,
there's the Russian guy. There's all the different white dudes.
Yeah.
But no, so there was various representation, but it was really unsettling to me that so clearly everyone on the crew understands Mandarin, and some of them speak Mandarin, and she exclusively speaks Mandarin while everyone else almost exclusively speaks English. And it just felt like she's Asian. Let's remind you that she's Asian, and she's the Asian representation, and she's from China. Yeah. And then she was excited about dumplings. It just felt like so many aspects of that could have been much more subtle and almost like they wanted a cookie for that kind of representation. Well, no, not even that. Just I felt like they did a very poor job of integrating her into the rest of the crew and keeping her othered.
That's right. I was going to just use. That's exactly what I was just going to say. That it continues to other her in that space.
One of the reasons why I love films like this, I wrote a list of all of the kind of generic conventions that this movie offers us that I unironically love. And one of the things I love, Anita kept looking at my notes. This is why we can't watch movies together, because I know she was cheating off my paper. Yep. But one of the things I unironically love is a good old International Space Station or International Space Crew adventure. And one of the reasons why I love it is this kind of jigsaw puzzle of identity they try and use as a shorthand for, the Cold War is over, ethnic conflicts have passed. It's the future. We all get along, right? But in this very ham-handed way. And so one of the things that I loved about this movie, and no shade to the Irish. I know it sounds like it, but no shade to the Irish. But you have someone from the U.S., from the U.K. You have someone, I think Acosta was from Brazil. You have someone from China, and then you have someone from Ireland. And I was like, that's a random choice, right? Again, no shade to the Irish. Mundy was awesome.
I think that's a little bit of
shade.
I was just I think they just wanted an accent, but
exactly.
Still a white dude.
Yeah, and Chris O'Dowd is great, but it was just, I was like, oh yeah, the Irish, right on. Okay,
Yeah.
One of the notes that the only thing I remember from your notes that I was peeping on was how you said that Jensen was basically, you phrased it better, but that basically Tilda Swinton in space.
Oh. Yeah, she was like,
which I appreciated.
If Tilda Swinton and Gwendoline Christie collaborated on a space robot baby, they would have come up with Jensen.
That's exactly right.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
As all this stuff is happening on the space station, we occasionally return to the surface of Earth, but we're kind of kept in the dark about a lot of what's happening on Earth. But one line that happens in that space that I love is so when the exposition boyfriend is driving, and he's listening to the radio, like to news reports on the radio, and they talk about something disastrous happening in the residential suburb.
Yeah, I love that they're like generic area.
Exactly. Like there's, in major American city, this thing is happening. I
felt like the B story was really weak in this. That
Yeah, go ahead. It's purely, I think, the whole point of it seems to me, is to set up the sort of plot twist, if you can even call it that, that happens in the final 10 seconds of the film. Like that's almost the whole the thing, which ties it to other Cloverfield films.
Right, and apparently that was an add-on, right? So J.J. Abrams, initially, had conceived of this movie. It was originally called The God Particle. It was not related to the Cloverfield franchise at all. Huh. And then it was kind of retrofit for that. Sense. So we get, a clover at the end, as they're called. This gigantic, huge fucking clover that's exponentially bigger than the big one we saw in Cloverfield, the original movie, right? So in terms of what the fuck is happening-atude, this movie amps it up quite a bit and refuses to answer any questions. But so, I think part of the kind of jury rigging this thing into the Cloverfield franchise happened because it wasn't originally meant to be a Cloverfield movie at all. And I know, Anita, you just recently watched 10 Cloverfield Lane.
Yep.
But haven't seen the original, right?
Correct.
But, it's not as if seeing 10 Cloverfield Lane or the original Cloverfield would have aided you in watching this movie. They are completely separate properties.
I do. So I didn't watch Cloverfield, and I only watched 10 Cloverfield Lane because we were talking about this, and why not? I really love the concept of this sort of loosely connected it's not, I called it a franchise, but it's just loosely connected concept, films with different perspectives and people, but there's that one little bit that connects them all. And I really love the idea of it. And I'm curious how other creators can use that. I mean, you obviously have to have a big enough platform to be able to justify films across, a decade, for example. But it's kind of cool to see how you do these threads. And because I especially I gravitate to films or to media where there is very strong character and relationship development. I prioritize that over plot in a lot of ways for the way that I approach my criticisms.
Could I cut in here?
Yeah.
And just suggest people go back to last week's episode about Call Me By Your Name and say, Anita, do we truly believe that to be the case? Okay.
Fair.
Please continue.
No, that's fair. So not always. And you're right. I just think so. The example I always go back to when I talk about this is Rogue One. I feel like Rogue One had a really good plot and really terrible character relationships. And so yeah, I'm probably not totally consistent, but that is generally what I look for. But you're right. Yeah. I also am not a hopeless romantic, so I think that had to do with that. No, and I don't mean that in a mean way. But that story didn't matter as much to me. But I was saying something. So that's why I find this concept fascinating, because it really is about creating these different pockets of people and their experiences related to this larger, horrible, systemic thing that's happening in the world.
And that reminds me of, so one of my favorite novelists is David Mitchell, who wrote the novel that the film, he's probably best known to the public for writing the novel Cloud Atlas, which the film Cloud Atlas obviously is based on. But he has a whole, a bunch of novels, and interestingly, they are all kind of connected in often really subtle ways. It's not like they're a series where you have to read them in a kind of linear way, but a character who's a 12-year-old kid in one might be a 45-year-old, person in another or whatever. And that connection between the novels, the way that they kind of come together to form this universe isn't just it's a fun gimmick. It totally is, but it's more than that, because it works to make you feel like these characters' lives, yes, kind of as you say, are grounded in. It gives you more sense of perspective and a way that these characters' lives are grounded in the systems and the cultures and the time periods in which they lived, and how one time period really does just, and the actions of people in one time period really can directly influence another. So I'm a big fan of that as a concept. I think obviously it can be done more or less successfully, but I share your kind of excitement around that.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to bring up about just quickly about Cloverfield Paradox is that I have a question of I'm curious from our listeners if you can not recommend, but is there a pattern with women going into space because they lose their children? This happened in Gravity and it happened in this, and I would be curious to explore that sort of pattern if it exists in other ones. So hit me up at Anita Sarkeesian on Twitter and let me know.
I think in Aliens, they mentioned that Ripley's daughter has died while she was in... Was that correct, Ebony? So, I mean,
it's not correct. And so I was wondering, are you looking for people, for instances in which women have gone into space because their children have died, or after? Or are you
Let's say
opening it
after,
up to...
and then I will determine whether what the pattern is there, kind of thing. But I'm curious. So one of the things about this that I had a hard time with, but I think unfairly, like might just be my own shit. There is in life when couples lose a child, very often they don't stay together, or very often it's very tense, or they have a hard time overcoming that because it is literally the worst thing that could ever happen to you in life for the most part. And that isn't always the case, but we don't often see representations of couples who are still very loving and caring and together after something like that happens. And so I don't have a fully fleshed out thought around this, but it was an interesting choice to make in terms of how they built the relationship between Ava Hamilton and her exposition boyfriend, in terms of like they set it up so that she went to, like, he's like, you need to go to space to deal with this thing to save the world, but also because of this trauma of losing our child or our children.
Did we ever find out how long it had been since their children had died in the fire?
I don't think they made that clear. No,
because I don't know if y'all had the same reaction, but so Ava and I think his name is Michael, exposition boyfriend. Let's call him Eric. Eric exposition. They're having a conversation, over the giant space TV screen, and it cuts out before Eric exposition can say, "I wanted to ask you a very important question," or something to that effect, right? And then it transpires later that what he was going to say was, maybe it's time for us to try again, like have more kids. And of course they're not going to, but I was like, okay, that's going to go over like a lead fucking balloon, Eric. I'm thinking I'm pretty glad that you got cut off there, because I don't think that's going to be, something that you really want to broach in this instance.
Yeah.
Like,
and you've been apart for 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. So
cool.
Okay.
All right. Cloverfield Paradox is on Netflix if you want to check it out. And that was our opinions on it. The next topic we want to talk about today, we want to talk about a topic today as opposed to another piece of media. So Formula One racing announced on January 31st that they will be ending the long-standing practice of using walk-on grid girls at the beginning of their 2018 World Championship Series. Now, a grid girl is basically the equivalent of like a convention booth babe. They model, they're models, they hold signs, they like line the corridors when the victors walk out, they celebrate the player, that kind of thing. And in Formula One's statement, part of what they said was, while the practice of employing grid girls has been a staple of Formula One Grand Prix for decades, we feel this custom does not resonate with our brand values and clearly is at odds with modern day societal norms. We don't believe the practice is appropriate or relevant to Formula One and its fans, old and new, across the world. Now, we tweeted this out because I'm a smartass and I wanted to be like, hey, video games, take a fucking cue, because you don't need to put grid girls in your goddamn video game, your racing games anymore. But what was so interesting, so we got a shit ton of backlash from that tweet, and also there was a backlash to Formula One in general from fans, from racers, from folks, and I wanted to unpack some of that difficulty, or some of the backlash and the theory and thoughts behind it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think
Why don't you take us through your favorite reaction?
Yeah, so my favorite reaction, we got a number of very thoughtful replies on Twitter, but perhaps the most thoughtful and thought-provoking, a tweeter by the name of Kim Jong-Kuk replied simply, quote, "Nice, less jobs for women," end quote. Which is very, but actually, like the over,
because you really care.
Yeah, right, exactly. Kim Jong-Kuk deeply cares about women.
Don't you care about the wage gap, Anita?
Oh my God!
But in fact, like most of the replies that are in some way critical of this, that's what they land on is how can feminism be, quote unquote, against women, choosing to do this job.
Yeah, totally. There was a YouTube video that got passed around quite a bit from Rebecca Jackson, who is a race car driver. Race car driver.
Sure.
I don't know if she's in.
I believe the
Formula
technical
1
term is
or a
speed
different
racer
kind of thing, but I found it's like a 3 to 4 minute video, and that got sent to us a lot on Twitter. And I found it really incredibly frustrating, but also just she articulates very well all like the opposite of all the things that are wrong with this, right? So she's really using and also attacking feminism in this complicated way that we see a lot when we bring up these topics. So she's talking about how choice is being taken away from women. Right. She goes into how it's a glamorous job with glamorous people. So why wouldn't you have glamorous women? And that whether they're male or female, we should open it up to grid men and all grid people as well. And she literally, I wish we had a bingo card for this because she hit all the goddamn bingo points. If women didn't want to be objectified, then they wouldn't do it. It's just the way the world works. And in the future, you could choose to be... And in the future, because of feminism, we should create a space where you can choose to be a racer or a grid girl. Equal opportunities for these fucking positions. And this brings up the point in that this is what is used against us when we talk about that there are certain... that when we talk about these kinds of things, and this is really called choice feminism.
Exactly.
Right? Which is co-opting the language of feminism, and it's taking an individualistic belief that any choice a woman makes is a feminist choice, regardless of how it affects women as a whole or as a society or systemically. And it's bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to, as long as women are valued to such a degree for their physical appearance that a position like grid girls even kind of makes sense to people as a thing that women can and should be doing. While, of course, everyone, I mean, despite what people say, everyone, I think, fundamentally understands, well, grid guys is just not a thing that's going to happen because we don't think of men in those terms, and there isn't a desire or, an appetite for that at all on any level. The fact that we as a culture think about women in these terms actually fundamentally limits women's freedom and women's choices in our culture, right? Because, well,
yeah, absolutely. And I unpacking this shit, man, right? She is taking the status quo as the baseline norm.
Exactly.
And she's saying that, what we have now is the best that we're going to get. And so how do we how do we just accept the status quo? And how dare you change anything? And that's what, Ivanka Trump is not a fucking feminist. She's choosing to do whatever the fuck she wants to do, right? And if you believe in choice feminism,
right,
you believe that literally anything any woman chooses to do is feminist, whether they're literally in charge of, fighting against abortion rights, whether they're in charge of perpetuating international wars that harm people around the world, all of this crap. And it makes me mad because it's this isn't about you could even unpack the notion of what beautiful people are,
right,
what that means. It's so fucking limited.
Exactly.
And so there's so many layers to this that it's so incredibly frustrating. And that, it's the same thing where I think we need to look at all of this stuff systemically, because people will be like, well, if women didn't want to be sexualized in films, then they just wouldn't take those jobs, right? And so you think about all of the naked women in Game of Thrones. These are women who who have auditioned for 500,000 roles and been turned down for all of them and are just trying to make a break in Hollywood, right, as the career that they want. And so they're kind of, through this system, quote unquote, forced to take on those roles if they want to do this career. That is a problem with the system, not a problem with the women who are taking those jobs.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the things that I found interesting is... I will admit that when I first read about this story breaking, I didn't read it carefully. And so I assumed, and this reveals, like my bias against, certain things. I assumed they were talking about NASCAR. Right. And so I thought, wow, what a bold choice for NASCAR, which is, a sport that is, kind of has a heavily North American fan base, but also, is explicitly coded as a working class, a white working class sporting activity, right? So I was like, wow, what a bold choice. That's very interesting. And so then when the backlash started coming, I was not at all surprised. When I realized that we were talking about Formula One, which to my mind, like I never think about Formula One being a sport that people in America, North America anyway, really participate in or, know much about. And so I wonder how much of this backlash is a generic kind of, misogynist, gasping at, even though I don't give a shit about Formula One, have no idea what Formula One is, you're not going to take my sexy women away from me.
A lot of it is, yeah.
In the same way that people who don't live anywhere near a Hooters will defend to the desk the right of women to wear shorty shorts and, boob tops at Hooters. But because Formula One is such... It's like soccer, right? Like I think of this incredibly, vastly popular sport that doesn't really have a hold in the United States, and yet so much of the backlash came from people in the United States, right? Who are just regurgitating, as you said, these kind of, these false choice feminists, dicta like, oh, if a woman is truly free, she should be free to, dress sexy and, shake it on a race course and whatever. And it's like, don't act like you give a shit about women and about the advancement of women. And also don't act as if all of these choices have equal weight or equal stakes, especially, this speed racer. What was her name? Stephanie? Whatever that you were talking about.
Jackson.
Oh my God. Am I the worst co-host? Yes.
All good.
Answers on a postcard, right? For her, as one of the, probably you can count them on two hands, female race car drivers, to say this choice is equal, knowing the barriers that she has had to overcome to become, a race car driver, to say, yeah, it's, you can become this or you can become a grid girl. Give me a fucking break. Like, they just seem so disingenuous.
Yeah. And, so I don't know this for a fact by any means, but a lot of times women who enter male-dominated sports will end up on the cover of Sports Illustrated in fucking bikinis and shit, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the cost, the women in those positions have a really high cost for entry into those spaces, and they can't challenge the sexist patriarchal norms of those spaces because they had to fight to get into them. They're not about to challenge it because they won't be accepted. And so I think that there's my heart always breaks every time I see people from different types of oppressed backgrounds speaking up for their oppressors, right? And that is 100% what this is. It is women who are coming up and defending patriarchy full force because that is the power structures, and they don't have the access to or the ability to or whatever in order to sort of join feminist thinking around challenging that and making the world better for everyone, not just them and not just their one way. Because she's the margin of error, which is what you were just saying, Ebony. Yeah, it is. How many female race car drivers on a professional level are there actually? And we will probably get people being like, here are the three, right? As the defense. Yeah. And I'm like, you're the margin of error. The other thing that you were saying that I was thinking about is how a lot of the backlash, a lot of the backlash we get are from misogynist pieces of shit dudes that are like, why don't you care about women in the Middle East? Right? They don't give a fuck about women. They don't care about progress or advancement. They just want their fucking porn and their sexualized women in video games. And you want to talk about women in the Middle East? Cool, let's do it. My family fucking lives there, right? Like, that shit, and not that that's the point, but that shit makes me really mad because they just try to find the thing that is like an easy...
They're concern trolling. They're concern trolling.
Yeah, and
totally.
It's a derailment tactic.
Absolutely derailing.
It's like, it's this notion that as long as things, you know, in your culture are not the literal worst that they could be, you know, compared to everywhere else in the world, it's not worth fighting to make them better, which is, it's completely absurd.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, you know, it's really important that we can identify and understand choice feminism when it hits us in the face, right? That, like, you know, putting, you know, the reason that this woman is getting so much attention right now is because she is able to defend the status quo, and that, you know, it's very easy to use that. And it's used against us in Gamergate too, when like women in games or female gamers will be like, fuck Anita and her bullshit, I like big boobs. And I'm like, and that's not the point.
And it gives these men who are so invested in maintaining the status quo and maintaining a culture in which the objectification of women is standard and normalized. It gives them a way to sort of defend that position as quote unquote feminist, because these women, these liberated women are saying like they're in favor of it, and that these women just choose to do this, and like you want to take that choice away from them. It's super frustrating.
I think this opens up a lot of space to continue the conversation around booth babes and how those should not be around. How, like, every year at GDC, no matter how, that's the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, no matter how many times we like feel like we're making progress in games, there's some fucking party with some female like dancers, or last year it was like swimming in a fucking women in like little synchronized swimming outfits in a fucking ball pit. Like, it was...
Wait, what?
Yeah, that was the whole thing that happened last year. So, like, how do we continue this conversation? And you posted a video about this?
Well, the video that I posted in our Slack, and I'll post along with this, is that in the UK, just now, I think after F1 announced that they were getting rid of Grid Girls, there was a gambling convention in the UK where the organizing body said, please, don't bring booth babes into this. We're trying to move past that. And yet a tremendous number of the exhibitors did still employ booth babes and
they were harassed and groped and fondled, as happens when you have a fucking bunch of dudes in a room and like half naked women on display for them, right? And so they actually they referenced the Formula One announcement when they decided to change their, I think that they may be changing their policies around what is allowed in that space as well. So kudos to Formula One. I think this is a really great move, regardless of why they're doing it. And I hope that this has rippling effects into other industries that can, not put women on display as like objectifying tokens for their presumed male audiences.
Right. I mean, it's certainly been...
And the cry goes up from men everywhere.
Yeah.
What about my boner?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really weird. I don't care about their boners.
Weird.
It's weird, right?
Well, we're going to... Anita, that is... We're going to have to talk about that because I think you should.
All right. Any last thoughts about this?
No, I think that was a good talk.
Did we accomplish our goal?
Yeah, I think we accomplished our goal of upsetting a good number of our listeners. So it's going to be great.
I think our listeners are going to be super down.
But I think it may. Yeah, they may share it. Some people may share it with other people just to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, we're
that's what we do.
Instigators.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. I really like throwing in little themes to discuss every now and again, as opposed to pieces of media. Let us know what you think. I enjoy.
Yeah, I love that too, because it means I don't have to leave my house.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. All right. Let's move on to what's your freak out. Dun, 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 dun. I don't know if we have a theme song yet, but I just made it up. Hey, Ebony.
Hey, Anita.
What's your freak out this week?
Y'all are going to be blown away and shocked that my freak out this week is Once again, a crime drama. That's right, everybody.
What?
So my 10 followers on Twitter, I had mentioned several weeks ago, back at the dawn of the podcast age, that I was so frustrated by, I had just started watching Ripper Street, and I was so frustrated by the way in which, once again, we have a show that is, written on the bodies of women, and yet, very little of the agency in the show seemed to come in and through women, right? And that changes a bit as that show progressed, as we went on through the seasons. But nevertheless, I think it's a trope that bears, discussion throughout the genre. So anyways, several people had mentioned that I should try watching Mindhunter on Netflix.
Oh, yeah. I saw that.
Yeah, so I've gotten through, I think, the first 8 episodes. I think I have 2 more. And I am fascinated by this show and how much it puts a very kind of articulate gloss on what other shows like, I don't want to say down market, but, kind of, CBS drama, fill in the blanks, connect the dots crime dramas do, like Criminal Minds, for instance. So Mindhunter is the story about kind of the beginning of profiling and, behavioral science, or the expansion of the behavioral sciences unit at the FBI, and the kind of development of these protocols and understanding of what they would term the criminal mind. And what's so frustrating to me, and I don't know if this changes any in the last 2 episodes, but what's so frustrating to me is that very provocative, thoughtful ideas are presented and then kind of dismissed or are left to lie. So for instance, there's a conversation between the main character, Holden Ford, and his girlfriend, who's a postgrad in sociology. And she talks about the notion that maybe criminality or criminal behavior is a response to a sickness in society. Right? So it's not just that people are doing more horrible things, quantitatively or qualitatively, but that as society itself, kind of exhibits various forms of sickness in the terms of, oppression, capitalism, et cetera, that criminal behavior is a rational response to that. Right? And that sort of gets completely left behind. It doesn't get reckoned with at all. And it becomes this show that is really, enamored with the idea of what are the men like who chase these criminals? What are the criminals themselves like? But once again, it is the women who are presumably like the inciting factor, the rape or the torture or the murder, the brutalization of these women, once again, is just kind of background. It's stuff that they bring to the table in the toolbox, but it's not, these women have no voices of their own. It's a, very male show deliberately. And I can hear people saying, well, it's set in the late 70s. Of course, it's going to be a very male show, right? But it was a choice to create the show in this way, right? And decide, we're once again going to tell the story through the lens of how these men feel about it. One of the other things that I found interesting is that because it's not, a 21 episode primetime drama, it's not like a monster of the week type thing. So that, there's a new serial killer every week, and we show, a team of dedicated, law enforcement officials chasing down the perpetrator and then resolving that in some measure of justice, for whatever value of justice you believe in, being meted out. It's a very cerebral show. It's very theoretical and abstract. And so there's a way in which we don't even get the kind of, emotional resolution of seeing people brought to justice in this show, Yeah. So there are people who are already in jail that, that the profilers are speaking to. And there's, kind of the occasional case that they consult on, but that's not the aim of the show. And so I wonder, for people who, like me, watch a lot of these crime dramas, if this show doesn't offer the same kind of, it doesn't scratch the same itch, because it doesn't give us that very visceral kind of like you can take a breath. There's this, horror out in the world, and it was resolved. It was dealt with. The show doesn't give us that. So I'm interested to see what happens in the last 2 episodes. Obviously, you know, if you've seen the show, you know that there's this killer in, I don't know, bumfuck Kansas or whatever that they're about to reckon with. So we'll see what happens. But for the yos of all asking me if I've watched Mindhunter, yes, I'm wrapping that shit up right now. I have thoughts. They're not fully formed, but that's my freak out this week.
Nice. We should definitely talk about it because I watched the show, and I think that there's going to be a season 2, I think. So
yeah, there is.
I feel like that would be a good topic for us to dive into on Feminist Frequency Radio, which you're listening to right now. All right, Caro, what is your freak out this week?
My freak out this week is the comedy of Remarriage.
What's that?
So the comedy of Remarriage is, I'm glad you asked, it's a subgenre of American comedy films of the 1930s and 40s. At the time, the production code, also known as the Hays Code, banned any explicit references to or attempts to justify adultery and illicit sex. So the comedy of Remarriage enabled filmmakers to evade this provision of the code because the protagonist divorced, flirted with strangers without risking the wrath of censorship, and then got back together. So in the past week, I've watched 2 classic comedies of Remarriage, both with Cary Grant in the leading male role. The Philadelphia Story, which has Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, and Jimmy Stewart, and His Girl Friday, which has Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell. And so just like, I wanted to watch films that were smart and snappy and funny. And like the dialogue in these films, you know, they really do not write films like this anymore. They're so smart and so sharp and so witty. It's sort of like West Wing guy. What's his name?
Aaron Sorkin.
Sorkin, but like good,
better,
and like way better and like amped up. And you just have these situations where, you know, characters are just so snappily and funnily interacting with each other. It's delightful to watch. And yet the gender dynamics like are super interesting. So let me, you know, for instance, in His Girl Friday, real quick, it's a newspaper film. It's a newspaper comedy. Cary Grant's the editor of this paper. Rosalind Russell is Hildy Johnson, this like ace reporter, totally brilliant writer. So you have a, you know, representation of a woman who's sharp, smart, witty, like the best reporter on the paper. But so she and Cary Grant, the editor, used to be married. They divorced. She comes back with this guy she's going to marry and just go live in Albany with and not be a reporter. She's going to like leave the newspaper game. But Cary Grant knows that like her soul, her heart, her fire, her passion is all like she is in her blood a newspaper reporter. And so he does all this scheming and everything to put her in a situation where she realizes that she is at heart a newspaper reporter. And in the end, through that realization, also realizes she doesn't want to just go to Albany and be this guy's wife and be a mother to kids. She wants to stay with Cary Grant and be in the newspaper game, and they go off to get remarried. And it's like super interesting because on one hand, you have this portrayal of a woman, and Katharine Hepburn in the Philadelphia Story is somewhat similar, of like a woman who's strong and independent and you know, just a really interesting, complex woman. And yet the kind of the plot and the machinations of the comedy of Remarriage sort of dictate that the way they discover who they really are and who they want to be and what they want from life is through a man kind of like manipulating and scheming and putting and doing all this stuff that's really unethical to make them realize like, oh, I am like a newspaper reporter at heart. Like I do want to, this is who I am. This is what I want to be. So, I mean, I really enjoyed watching these films. Like they are just pure cinematic pleasure. So well written, so sharp, so smart. But just like also like really just there's a lot to dig into and unpack there around the gender dynamics. So anyway, you know, if you're like a movie buff like me and you've never seen these films, I highly recommend watching them. They're really fun, but also, you know, kind of messed up.
And
I can't wait for Caro's Cinema Corner, you know, when you'd have the podcast where you just talk movies. I can't wait for this.
All right, my freak out. So first of all, I want to thank everyone who's tweeted at me about The Expanse. It was very divided in terms of whether I should continue watching or not continue watching. I have now started watching season 2. I've been live tweeting it, so if you want to see my responses, feel free to check out my Twitter at Anita Sarkeesian. And I will have my season 2 freak out when I'm done watching that. All right. I would like to talk about expiration dates of shows. And I'm going to use Grace and Frankie as the lens for this. So I am a strong proponent of shows having a vision of how it starts and how it ends, and then building in the amount of seasons needed to accomplish that goal, as opposed to just like, let's try to stay on the air forever so that we have jobs and whatever, right? Like for all the reasons that could happen and just get continually renewed and for over and over. I love Grace and Frankie. I fucking love the show. Like I get so excited when a new season comes out. It is a Netflix show that stars Jane Fonda, Lily Tomlin, Martin Sheen, and Sam Waterston, and like all-star cast, right? And the thing about Grace and Frankie that I think is so spectacular is that it actually, like, we very rarely see the lives and concerns and experiences of older people like in their 70s ever. Like that is not, you are like the washed out grandmother, or you're like, you know, you're the like the magical person that we come to get information from or guide us on our path, but you're never the star of the show. And so I think just that premise alone is spectacular. And the concept of the show is that these are couples, straight couples, and it turns out that the men have been having an affair together forever, and they finally tell their wives and get divorces, and like their whole lives get turned upside down. So I highly, highly recommend checking out the first few seasons of this show because I think it's very, very good, and there's lots of wonderful stuff there. I've been watching the 4th season, which just came out, and I kind of feel like the show is done. And it's disappointing because I love it so much. And I think that some of the themes that they're talking about in this particular season are great in terms of like, you know, like what happens when your friends start having like have to go into a home because they're having memory loss, or like, what does it mean to date and have relationships at 70? Like, coming to terms with like nearing death, for example. There's a cute moment in this where Martin Sheen and Sam Waterston's characters, like, they're really excited about being gay, and so like they're learning about activism and how, like, you know, homophobia is still very real, and so like there's all these moments where they keep getting arrested for like being activists. It's really cute. But then there are things that they don't know about, like, quote unquote being gay and like what it means in that community. So like there's a whole conversation right now about like open relationships, and one of the characters is like, I'm Catholic, I would never do that, but everyone else that are gay men in this world are like, yeah, you might want to consider it. So I think that there's some really lovely stuff. I think the end of the season is better than the beginning of the season, but I do like, not to throw the show under the bus because I kind of just wanted to talk about it, but I was a little bit disappointed because the first half of the season 4 just felt like, okay, I think you're done. Like, I think you're done telling this story. Why don't you tell a different story? Why don't you move on to something else entirely? And so that's it. Mm-hmm. I would encourage creators to have a beginning and end point of their stories so that like it stays with us in this really meaningful way, as opposed to being like, oh yeah, don't like Gilmore Girls. Everyone likes the first 2 seasons of Gilmore Girls, and the rest of it is fucking garbage. I know, that's true. But, but the people who do like it. So anyways, all right. I will stop.
Speaking of that kind of rapid fire patter, Gilmore Girls, I was like, oh my God, listening to that show made me want to punch babies. I love movies from the 30s, you know? And it worked in those movies, but Gilmore Girls, nope.
All right, y'all, that is our show. You can catch us back here every single Wednesday. We could not make this podcast happen without our generous backers on Drip. Drip is Kickstarter's new subscription-based crowdfunding platform. Help us keep bringing this podcast to you every week by joining the FemFreak community. We've got some great rewards for you, so pitch in now at d.rip/FemFreak. If you're enjoying the show, we have a small favor to ask you. You know what it is. Please leave us a review on iTunes or anywhere that you are listening to this podcast, because it really, really helps us spread the word about the show. And, tell all of your friends, too, who might just be sitting on the couch all day Saturday and Sunday watching TV shows alone.
I feel attacked.
That's what I did.
Yeah.
I couldn't think of a better location. Sorry, y'all. You can check out all of our work and our other podcasts at feministfrequency.com. We just released the last episode of our Star Trek Discovery podcast for the season, and we released a very special bonus. So if you care about Star Trek, please check out our special Science-y Y&C bonus episode. We are preparing all new exciting podcasts, so be sure to follow us on Twitter at FemFreak to stay up to date on all of the news. And as always, we want to hear from you. Carolyn, where on Twitter might people send you beautiful messages of adoring fan mail?
Please send those to me at Carolyn Michelle.
Ebony, who do you want to send things to this week?
To my address. So that's at What Are You Doing, Arm? On Twitter and Instagram.
Alternatively, send all your wild conspiracy theories about Star Trek to at Ebony Aster. I am at Anita Sarkeesian. Our producer is Phil Circus, who also composed our theme music, and we'll see you all next week. Bye. Nobody's going to say bye?
Oh, bye.
Later.
Oh, Lord.